Bon dia.
Good morning. Let's continue with this session. I have the honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Thank you for being here. José Núñez, Seixas. I don't know if we need any further introduction. One of the most prestigious historians we have in our country. So thank you for having accepted this invitation. He's a professor at the University of Santiago de Compostela. His work about identities, conflicts is highly prolific. Conflicts in the 20th century, actually. And he's been awarded many prizes, amongst which we have Walter Benjamin Award, Democratic Memorial, and Exile. We collaborated with him and we launched in that small city of Portbou, together with the City Council of Portbou, an event that is, and as part of the economic limitations, well, they every year call this award. And well, thank you for being here. You also collaborate with different policymakers, and we were talking about this with other participants. So you collaborate with the autonomous government of Galicia, counseling, cultural events. You have participated in different media. And other than your research activity and scientific and academic activity, well, those of us who try to be here, you collaborate in the promotion, dissemination of history and partly of memory, with work related to places of memory and the transnational memories. That, in fact, is one of your main interests. We and you have in this observatory our capacity of analyzing other cases in this kind of history and memory compared from a transnational way. So let me give you the floor. It's a real pleasure to have you here. We'll open up a Q&A session. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Jordi. Thank you very much to the organizers of this event and of this conference for your kind invitation and offering me the honor of delivering this closing conference. I am part of an institution called the Consejo de la Cultura Galega that has no comparison in other regions. It's a statutory counseling body, independent from the political power, so I don't collaborate with the government. But I wanted to stress this fact. Sometimes we collaborate and we have elements of coincidence, other times we don't. In any case, as we usually say, this is a complex topic, and the best possible way of not saying anything is try to say everything. So I will focus on some general characteristics of the discourse of memory in Europe in World War II since 1945, on the role of the heroes and the role of victims, and within it how women and childhood, according to the framework topic of this Congress, falls in these commemorative practices, with a special emphasis in the cases that I know best, that is Germany and the Soviet Union, or the post-Soviet space. Also make reference to other contexts. It's worth mentioning that if something has characterized or characterizes the memory discourses in the first stage after the long post-war between 1945 and 1960, it's the dissidence and forget oblivion with respect to victims. You remember the victory, but not the victims. You condemn some perpetrators in the Nuremberg processes, etc. You excuse, you reintegrate small Nazis and colorationists, both in Western Europe as well as in more progressively in Eastern Europe. 1950, the Unified Party of Western or Eastern Germany said that big Nazis have been condemned. Those that remain are small große Botzen, kleine Nazis. the big ones and the small ones, and the little kleine Nazis could be recycled. And Soviets were well, they liked to recycle. Some people had developed the vertical chip of vertical obedience chip. Anti-fascism was established as an ethical matrix of Western democracies, but also of popular democracies of Eastern. You skipped the winners, partisans, the Red Army, the Allied troops. There was other winners. Some of them fell in the interest of oblivion. The most flagrant case was that the Polish Inner Army, Linia Krajowa, in 1948-49, was totally forgotten in the Polish Republic, where they only remembered the Alarmia Ludowa or the Popular Army of a pro-Soviet character. And that would reach the 1980s. Now, if you walk around Warsaw, you'll see all over the place the symbol of the Armia Krajowa, this smaller army, with a clear identification of all the forms of resistance against Nazism through that organization. Particular interest was placed on those that fell in combat, big memorial monuments, war cemeteries, but it was always so in the Soviet Union, curiously, where the big cemeteries of the fallen were built in the occupied Europe, or the free Europe. They were built in Berlin, they were built in Budapest, they were built out in the outskirts of Warsaw. But curiously, they were not built in the Soviet Union, where up until the 1990s of last century, in some areas it was still possible to walk in the forest and find human remains. Very well, in the Volkov front, you could find some, but there was an initiative that would try to give a name to the fallen ones. Obviously, this was easy, or rather easy, to commemorate the winners and commemorate the fallen from the Wehrmacht on the FF. These were Austrian and German dilemma up until now, and I'll tell you more about some cases. But what actually happened, for that reason, some German graveyards, they only want to, look at these graveyards and see who is there. If you go to a German graveyard or cemetery, there's always a monument to the fallen with all the names, and there is a mention fallen in the war 1943 to 1939 to 1943, and that was it. And in Italy, it's even more than that. Out there as an anti-fascist modality, but the monuments to the fallen usually includes fallen caduti della Seconda Guerra Mondiale, 1940-1945. This includes those that fell for fascism, those that fell in Eritrea, and those that fell in Libya or Alamein, those that fell in Russia, those that died in the Dom, the partisans, etc. So they covered the widest spectrum of people who lost their lives. In this case, the condition of victim was honorable. No one wanted to be there. Even the victims of the Holocaust, when they reached Israel, well, they didn't really like to be listened to. People didn't like to listen to them because their memories were the memories of the losers. The colons in the First War, well, had memories that were positive, and they considered that their Polish or Ukraine relatives had been taken to the slaughterhouse without any resistance. This was so until the year in the 60s. No one wanted to be a victim. The victims hid their own condition. If this happened in Israel, well, what would not happen in other countries? The honorable condition was being a hero, and monuments in Europe to well, you can see memories about the Red Army, and they honored the victories, which is a vertical culture, not a horizontal, honor to the winner. Categories such as Soviet war prisoners that lost in captivity, more than 45%. In German jails, Zwangsarbeiter, the forced labor, were taken aside, except for some exceptions. They were not even considered war victims. They were cowards from the Stalinist discourse. They were not comparable to those that had fought in Stalingrad or that had freed Berlin. In this situation, what was the role of children and women? Well, basically, yesterday, the board mentioned it, and they had an illustrative use: children as victims, women as victims. They are present in the war propaganda in the First World War. Propaganda about the German atrocities in Belgium. This poster, we could see it yesterday, which is an image that is worth mentioning. It's a U.S. Image to support the purchase of war bonds. Well, that was a Fritz, a German with a Prussian helmet and a big mustache. And she was taking a kid, a girl, a woman, a girl, in the bathroom of destruction. The other image, less known, it's in Edinburgh, in a college. It's a value of German culture. It's from 1917. Here you can see how Germans kill civilians, mainly women and children, in Belgium. This illustrative trend continued in other conflicts. These images of the Spanish Civil War, very well known, mainly to illustrate the atrocities caused by the German aviation and the Italian aviation. What are you doing to prevent this, to avoid this? With the idea of first, you are bombing us, tomorrow they'll bomb you. We have others that are comparable, but the illustrative role as victims, how bad the enemy is, but also women in the... Well, women had other roles in society in the Soviet Union. How are they remembered? In the World War II armies, in most of them, women played their role as nurses or support people helping the military state. And in the Red Army, we had women fighting in the front with guns, with some problems, but they were there. And then we had the partisans, some of them. There's a long list of heroines in the Soviet Union. They were remembered as heroines, the most widely known, Zoya Kozmodeminskaya, a partisan leader that was killed by Germans, cruelly tortured and murdered. There's pictures of that event, which up until now has not been depicted in any pictures in the Soviet Union or in Europe or US. And the same with the other big heroine, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the sniper that killed many German soldiers. And she had to wait up until 2015 to appear in a movie. They were not given the same protagonism as men or here. There's a metro station that I could find this picture. The Partisanskaya, the partisan station, Zoya Kozmodeminskaya, appeared in many stamps in popular democracies, such as in the case of the Democratic Republic of Germany. But the role was either that, a role of heroine, but a heroine that was never, that will never become a big heroine, or it was the Rovina Mater, the motherland, that was waiting to receive children, brothers, or fathers that will never come back, or that call people into action. Here we can find it in Berlin. It's a cemetery, more interesting that helped up in Hauptstraße. You can see this image of the mother. It's not it's a pietà. It's not sitting, it's standing, because she is looking into the infinity so that others revenge her child. If you looked at her in person, you feel like taking a gun and kill the bad guys. But in Germany, obviously, you have many other statues of women calling people into arms. She's not the most beautiful, but she's very well known in Stalingrad and Kiev. This evokes St. George, the patron of Russia, the Rovina Mater from Kiev. she included the Ukrainian trident, eliminating other more Soviet images. It's a recurrent image in the Russian wars, which intend to symbolize the idea of the mother that is waiting for her children, the mother that offers her children to the motherland, to the homeland, and that there is an umbilical cord. It's not very original, but in any case, it will appear in the movies, even currently in Putin's Russia. In Germany, the protagonists, above all, are are some women that, well, one could invoke. They had been the victims in 3 different fronts. There is an exculpatory discourse that reaches the 1980s from last century, according to which Germans had been the victims of a minority of fanatics that had kidnapped their will and that had abandoned their soldiers to their fate, mainly in Stalingrad. Stalingrad becomes an obsession in the post-war literature where fighters are good and Hitler is the bad guy. And his team of collaborators, the generals of Wehrmacht, are good professionals, and Wehrmacht had probably developed a clean war. However, there were 2 types of women victims. On one, there is a taboo. Millions of women that were raped by Red Army soldiers, not only, but there were rapings done by French and American soldiers. But here we're speaking about massive rapings in Western Prussia and Eastern Prussia and in Russia. Some calculations talk about 18% of all women between 12 and 70 years of age raped in some areas of Eastern Europe. But it's a totally repressed memory, even at a family level. I could mention cases, even in my political family, and also families of friends, where they learned about this decades after. They supposed that there was something that wasn't told, that it was the untold family story. The protagonists of this were the Trümmerfrauen, the women of the rubble. Men were absent, they had either died or they were in captivity. In Soviet captivity, that was the one that lasted the most. Who could rebuild the Germany of the rubble? The big myth prior, the big economic myth. Women helping in, well, they. Well, this was a kind of invented image. Not all women were mobilized. It was some kind of punishment imposed to women who were part of the Nazi party, or the women or the sisters of top people in the Nazi party. This was some sort of a collective inspiration. As you may remember that famous scene of 1, 2, 3 in Billy Wilder, when they asked the concierge, I said, "Where are you? What did you do in war?" He said, "In the afternoon round in the subway station. Down there, we didn't really know what was happening upstairs." And the top executive was asked, "What happened with Adolf?" He said, "Adolf? Who? Who's Adolf? I was down there." Many American soldiers were sent to Germany went when asking about Adolf, they said, "Adolf who? Oh, the guy with the mustache. That's probably next. They go to next town." They hosted Americans very nicely. They thought that Americans thought that the Germans were so civilized and educated. They gave them coffee and pastry. Well, this seemed like that this was behind the scenes with the Trümmerfrauen. Children, well, these women had written literary works supporting the pragmatism and survival of German women in the post-war, who on their own had to work for the family, had children mainly, and oftentimes, well, they created convenience relations with widows from the war. They were called the uncle in, the uncle partners. They knew that partner was mom's lover, but it was like in priests. No, that priest was the uncle as well. Well, what was the role of kids? Well, they had a collateral position in Germany, in other Eastern European countries. The public opinion in the public Western sphere, well, they were known with images of children who always were in a passive position. The repression picture of the Warsaw ghetto in the Museum of the Holocaust. Oh, a not so well-known figure that appears in several films about the Holocaust. The kids, in the orphanage of Dr. Korczak in the Warsaw ghetto, 190 to 196 of them went to Treblinka. They have a monument in Warsaw. In any case, children, women, well diluted inside the general category, at least in the Soviet discourse about the war that will last in the 1960s, 1970s, and that lasted up until now. And there are no groups inside victims. All of them are anti-fascist. And when we are dealing with civil victims, they are diluted in the groups of victims or unarmed Soviet citizens or Pacific Soviet citizens. In that category, you don't have Jews, you don't have psychic disabled people, etc., etc. Well, there are no further definitions. This is what fitted into these guys of capitalism. They wanted to kill, they wanted to eliminate the Soviet Union because of the class struggle, and well, their ideas didn't fit the Nazi struggle. There were other forgotten people, women raped, the victims of abuses, workers, forced workers in the Third Reich, kids, victims of hunger and privations, the siege of Leningrad, the civil victims of Stalingrad, who had to stay in the road because there was an order that impeded their evacuation to the other side of the Volga, the river. Well, poverty with malnutrition, on the privation, or the post-war hunger. Orphans were orphans. In the Soviet Union, we had to wait until the decade of the 1990s, after the perestroika, to consider that topic, so that kids had a certain protagonist role. There were some exceptions. For example, the
monument of cutting. Do not mislead it with cutting without age, where there are the mass graves of the official Polish officers executed in 1944. The authorities of the Belarusian Republic said that Belarus had been the most punished area when it comes to civil population, over 200 places being burned with the inhabitants in there, and Katyn or Hatyn, where hundreds of civilians had been killed, and it was the topic of several books. One written by Adamovich. Here we can see the child is an object, and in the protagonist is the grandfather, an emaciated grandfather. Some people think that Hatyn was chosen because the name was similar to Katyn. In the concentration camps, this famous statue by one of the big sculptor, Fritz Kammer, that has a monument devoted to the International Brigade, the Buchenwald Memorial of 1958. These people are victims, but are victims that have won. They have self-liberated themselves. What's the role of children there? It's a very secondary role. a child that has win. And if we look at other monuments, one in Treptow Park in Berlin, there is a big statue of the Soviet soldier that has a girl in their arms. It's the army that liberated EUROM from fascism. And here we can see sentences of Stalin that are subject of controversy now. But here we can find Soviet war propaganda that also appeared on stamps. And when we see children and women, we see them with weapons in their hands. They appear fighting. These are victorious men and women and children. In the Russian tradition, the partisans always wear a beard. Here, only children and women don't have a beard. Since 1961, the victims have a protagonism, and the 20th century becomes the century of victims, as Michel Vivorca said. The essays by Hannah Arendt, the Eichmann trial, all these are well-known facts, and even in Israel, the condition of victim of the Shoah is seen in a different way, and it becomes part of the foundational discourse after a period of silence, gaining some capital that now is being distracted in a systematic way. Children are victims, and we can clearly see more emphasis is put on persecuting the perpetrators that were not punished. That was the trials of Auschwitz in 1961, another one in 1965. And also going after the ones that had been recycled, the Klasfeld couple in France, and the famous scene with the president of the Republic, Kissinger, and do not mix up with Henry Kissinger, that it's been slapped by Beatrix Klasfeld because he had been a judge during the Nazi times, and then he was the president of the Federal Republic of Germany. And then the category of the victim has been broadened. Under Stalin, one was the hero, and Stalin was the main hero, and then one step down we have all the generals. Zhukov, who was then charged with corruption, and the main protagonist of the war becomes the Soviet population. It becomes a collective story. And we can see that Putin is presenting this narrative again. These are fighters that win. Alyosha, Alexei, it's like the common name of the soldier that won the war. Magnitogorsk, a worker. And we don't see many women incarnating the image of the winners. We have the Nike, the image of the victory with a sword in the hand. Magnitogorsk is the author of the 3 statues. In Magnitogorsk, the sword was made. In Stalingrad, you show the sword, and in Treptow Park, you can see the sword crushing a swastika. In Stalingrad, we have a stela plaques in the Mala Hill, but children and women are not represented. Until 1993, and thanks to the pressure of the society in Volgograd, there was no monument to the children that had been victims, because it was a difficult subject, because Stalin had not allow the evacuation of civilians, and there were thousands of deaths of women, children, and old people. And it's what we see in films about the siege of Stalingrad. There is an exception, yeah. It's Leningrad. Particularly the memorial devoted to Leningrad that opened in 1975. Here it has a special features because we can see a collective protagonism. Is the resistance to the siege of Leningrad over 900 days when they were sieged by the Wehrmacht and the División Azul, the Blue Division. And here we can see the local narrative that put the stress on the heroism of a local population, civilians that were also helping building fortresses, women and children that were working too, and they died of starvation. It was a portrayal of the Soviet population. It was a memory that wasn't always easy with what was thought in Moscow. This memorial was closed for some time. Leningrad was the city of Lenin, not the city of Stalin. Was where the October Revolution started, and the Brezhnevian discourse will describe it as a moment where the Soviet identity was created. The October Revolution was linked to the Civil War, and it wasn't a comfortable memory, as it happens with today in Putin's Russia. During the perestroika, there was a debate about the role of civilian population. It was a more proactive discussion, and they were talking whether women and children that survived had to be considered war veterans and have the benefit of being a war veteran, not to be considered only civilians that help in the building of some constructions, but children that suffer malnourishment, and they suffered the consequences maybe for the rest of their lives. Whether these people should be considered war veterans. There are some exceptions. The Nack unter Wolfen novel by Bruno Apetz, published in 1958, had three different films were made out of this film. The last one in 2015, and talk about the boy from Buchenwald, Stefan Zweig, that died last year, who was deported when he was 3, protected by the members of the communist cell in the concentration camp in the months before the liberation of the camp, and many risked their lives so the child could survive. Why? Because the boy was the symbol of the rebirth. If the boy was able to survive, there would be hope. In the Soviet cinema, since Khrushchev, in the most prolific period of the new Soviet cinema, there were some exceptions. And concerning the First World War, we see in those films some children and some women. They don't have a main role in the film, but they appear nevertheless. Women continue to be the representation of the homeland that was waiting in vain for their children, partners, the mother. Here in a film by Jordi in 1965 is a sort of modern odyssey, a soldier that comes back after having been in the Red Army and having destroyed some tanks, comes back home temporarily. He comes across people who have deserted the army. He falls in love with a prostitute, and when he comes to see his mother, he has to go back to the army. So the mother is seeing how the son is going away again, and the final image is the mother seeing her son going back to the army. Another film by Mikhail Kalatozov, Cuando pasan las cigüeñas, is a woman saying goodbye to her lover going to war. The soldiers could not write a lot. She ends up marrying her cousin. He abuses her. She divorces him. And when the soldiers come back from Germany, she's hoping that her previous lover would come back. Someone tells her that he's dead. She starts crying. She had flowers in her hands, and then she distributes a flower among the soldiers who have just arrived. So she thinks my lover has sacrificed his life for the homeland. And children appear, but they are the victim of the moral value subversion. These children have had their childhood taken away from them, and there are other approaches, more traditional ones. A little girl is looking for her father, and that's the Czech version of Yuli Burichov. In 1959, a 5-year-old girl, the father is a partisan leader, persecuted by the Germans. She's hiding in the forest, and we don't see the father. He's the absent protagonist. This girl is a protagonist. The Childhood of Ivan by Andrei Tarkovsky in 1962, that presents the biography of an orphan boy that joins the Red Army, and because he's short, he can accomplish many things. He can go into minefields, but he ends up losing his childhood. He's full of hatred in the end, and the conclusion is not a clear one. It's an ambiguous one. It's partially reflecting the experience of Soviet children that had no childhood. Some other films concentrate on how these children survived the war. For instance, The Fate of a Man, that film by Sergei Gondachev, from 1959, is a war veteran that has lost all his family in the war. The house has been bombarded. Two of his kids died in the war battle. One, the last day of the war. He works as a truck driver, and he finds an orphan boy and that thinks that he is his father, so they create a sort of new family. And the same happened with the two Fyodors by Maria Hutsev of 1958, an orphan adopted by a war vet that has lost his family. Both are called Fyodor, but there is a crisis when the adult Fyodor falls in love with another woman, and the little Fyodor, or the younger Fyodor, is jealous, and in the end he comes to terms with the situation. These films show a reality of the post-war Soviet society. So the newly formed families, the reconstituted families, some people had lost family members, remarried. So the grandmother, for instance, had a family that had died during the Leningrad siege and then remarried. In the 70s and 80s, there is another film by Klimov that had important jobs or posts under Gorbachev that reproduces the massacre of Hatyn with an oniric or dreaming approach. It seems sometimes a Carlos Saura film. It's Massacre Come and See, where a protagonist is a child that is witnessing all the massacres committed by the German and the collaborators of Germans in Belarus. It's full of scenes of violence, children being thrown into flames, and the most scene is the one we can see all these perpetrators that are picture is taken of them, and we can see how they are pointing with a gun at this child that he became a successful actor. In the 70s and 80s, the topic of the perpetrators will be dealt with, the small perpetrators, the numerous German soldiers, particularly starting in the 90s when the SS, how the SS had collaborated with the killing of civilians in the Soviet Union, Poland, and other places. The question, the brave Italian myth will be questioned, put into question, and how Italian soldiers behaved themselves in Slovenia and other places, and the role of the Wehrmacht, the crimes of the regular army, and all this leads to uncomfortable question. It's like a grandfather, what did you do in Russia? There was an exhibition and the crimes of the Wehrmacht that received over 4 million visitors, but I'm not going to go into detail. After the exhibition, many people asked, well, what was my grandfather doing? And some people could recognize the grandfather in some pictures. There was a novel called Schaffe where this topic is presented as Halfiterka, or the perpetrators of the typing machine, those who didn't get their hands bloody, but they collaborated from the rear guard. Meryl Streep was the protagonist of a TV series, Holocaust. At the Dorf family, it was someone who was a Nazi and ended up collaborating, and the debate took place also in other countries. And clandestine memories appeared. And if we talk about children and women, we have the Anna Frank's diaries. This is Bergen-Belsen, half an hour away from where my in-laws live. The survivors of the Holocaust, this film. In the 90s, there were memories of the communist, the return of uncomfortable ghosts. In the post-Soviet republics, there was talk about the memories of the ones that had been deported by Stalinism, the resistant to Nazis. But if you visit the Museum of the Rise of Warsaw, there is only one reference to the raising or the fighting of the ghetto. There are Soviet monuments or pro-Soviet monuments that are being removed, and I'm not going to go into detail in that aspect. And all this had different consequences. There have been other memorial places that have appeared, competing with others already existing. In Lithuania, we have the discourse of the Soviet Holocaust that could be compared to the Nazi Holocaust. In Vilnius, we have a monument comparing the two Holocaust. They consider them two foreign Holocaust. Here there has been some people that were considered people who have collaborated and now are seen as heroes. In cases of Croatia, Stepan Bandera, for instance. In the Ukraine since the 90s. And that's a trend that has been going up with a certain kind of revisionism that is questioning the fascist matrix in Italy by Salvini and Meloni that have refused to commemorate April 25th. The victims of the partisans of Tito in Dalmatia, and the homages are being promoted. In Germany, maybe with less emphasis, Alternative for Germany wants to reestablish the pride of the Wehrmacht soldiers, to stop criticizing themselves and saying that in Germany, it's the only country where at the center of its capital there is a monument devoted to inflicting self-pain to its memory, and someone have suggested that the Third Reich was only a little part of the whole history of Germany, that it was like a little poo of a bird.
If this reaches the government of certain Länder, which has not been the case, they will stop supporting policies of the anti-fascist memory. In Buchenwald, we have scare people about this perspective. So the Thuringia Landa maybe fall in the hands of AfD. In other Eastern European countries, Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Baltic countries, etc., well, we've seen laws of collective memory, prohibition of matching certain things or comparing certain things. Also in Russia, any questioning of Stalinism can be considered the subject of a punishment. All this in Putin's Russia has been mixed with reinterpretation in autocratic and nationalist key of all the classic myths of the Brezhnev's time, with a certain degree of ambiguity when judging the figure of Stalin. Yes, he did it a bit too much without the forceful collectivization. Without his strong will, the Second World War wouldn't have been won. I will not extend beyond this. And the new corpses in all the corpses of Stalinism. We heard about the critical memory of colonialism, the recent colonial wars, highly problematic case of Portugal, for example. That was a big exception. In the Portuguese exceptions on the 25th of April, well, that included the Netherlands, where recently there's an element of connection with Indonesia and the variables of on the different types of gender. Childhood generates a certain degree of protagonism. In the 1980s, for example, Anna Frank, with more protagonism, and in Germany, we'll have from the first decade of the 21st century a new debate, partly with revisionist keys, with a certain will of recuperating the experience of societies and people that lived the war, about the bombings and the effect of bombings that left important psychological consequences in those that suffered them, and the mass rapings. There's a full theory, and authors have written several books about the so-called Kriegskinder, the kids of the war, the children of these Kriegskinder, the Nachtkriegskinder, or the grandchildren of this Chris Enkel, Susanne Bolde, has had important work published. A German writer, makes fun of this, thinking, well, we have the grandchildren of these people. Well, there are some traumas, the silence of the perpetrators, the children of children, problems transmitted to their children, and so on and so forth. Well, in any case, here we have a division because from Germany, for example, we have had a certain way of incorporating women and children, but mainly women, as the protagonists. This can be appreciated, for example, in the re-edition of Martha Hiller's diary, which narrates the rapings of the Red Army in Berlin, that had been unedited in the 1950s, but its re-edition was a real bestseller, and it's a movie version protagonized by Nina Host, a rather well-known actress in Germany, also generated a strong debate because it is a German-Russian production which narrates the rapings, the pragmatism of the Berlin women who accommodated to this situation. Martha Hill has a terrible sentence. She says, well, if several have to rape me, well, I will try to find just one person that rapes me, the strongest wolf in the pack that protects me from the rest. That's terrible, isn't it? Well, then the ambivalence, because many of these soldiers that got drunk at night appeared in the morning with a chunk of meat, saying Frau Koch, piece of meat. Using a toilet was something new for them. In Russia, distribution of this film was submitted to many problems and protests. They said that the film was comparable to the Goebbels propaganda, and several actors decided not to do this. And, well, he said, my grandfather was not a rapist. Why do I have to do this? Others, like the novels of Helge Schneider, the Italo-German writer, with a beautiful book called There's No Sky Over Berlin. She was the daughter of a perpetrator of a guardian of the SS, which in another book called Leave Me Alone, Mother, she narrated her difficult relationship with a mother that was internated, the issue of full families, suicide, where women, children, parents and grandparents jumped to the river and drowned to escape from the Third Red Army inspired, and this ran in parallel lines with the research about the amount of people in the Red Army. There were many anecdotes. One of them was about the town where my father-in-law lives, a town where apparently lived no problems. In the cemetery, there was a problem, reminding the people that fell from the Wehrmacht. You can see this. We have this monument to the deceased of World War I, where there was a mention of the fallen in World War II. And this row come from the 1945 anonymous soldiers that died in the last few days. And the CDU dominated the city council. They added this plate, and they included soldiers mobilized by Waffen SS. This plate was destroyed by local activists. But more interesting was that in the town we had workers, forced workers, women from Ukraine and Poland, and a kindergarten for their kids, some sort of a kindergarten. 28 of these kids were identified and had died due to lack of care, and they were buried in anonymous tombs. In 1929, with the collaboration of the local, in 1989, they identified these 28 children with their names, and with the collaboration of the place where the kindergarten was located, and they created different memorial plates. Well, in Eastern Europe, they still had, well, they eliminated actually monuments to the Red Army that oftentimes received strange names. Well, there was a taboo. They had never shown the Red Army soldiers as rapists. There's an exception, which is a brutal sculpture from Jerzy Szumczyk, Polish sculptor, Frau Kom. They said Frau Kom, woman come, which from 8 to 8 in the morning was exposed next to a Soviet tank, which was a part of the monument, and that was eliminated by police, considering the protests of the Russian embassy. The statue represented a Soviet soldier that raped a pregnant woman with a pistol in his hand. This is a punctual depiction, quite exceptional. In the Soviet or in the Russian or post-Soviet filmmaking industry, what roles do we still have now? On the one hand, children, curiously, are either the innocent look that reflects what happens in war, the case of Anna's War, a Ukrainian girl that takes refuge and is hidden by some gentle neighbors, a Jewish girl, and also in the chimney of a school. Well, they had a German command point, and she speaks Yiddish and understands German. She listened to the German commanders to see how they were planning the killing of her community. But also, we still also have the case of the children soldiers. This is the case of a Belarus production Soldadik, little soldier. That kid, such a cute thing. You feel like, kissing him. Well, that's a soldier kid with a history. His parents passed away. He's wandering in the forest. A Red Army unit adopted him, but he fights, he kills. And what happens with women? Women are still the mother, the spouse, the sister that waits for their relatives, waiting for them to come from the front. It's either that, or they are heroines represented as veterans. We still have an ambiguity. This was pointed out. The perpetrating women, and Alexievich wrote books showing how much soldier women in the Red Army reacted against the sexual harassment that they were submitted by their own colleagues, and also about how to react against the rapings that their own comrades could generate. Well, ultimately, the most important role of women and children is summarized by Oliver Hirschspiegel, the drowning in this final scene of the movie. If you remember the movie, Frau Junges, Hitler's secretary, this scene is totally fictitious, but the kid at first had been mobilized as fanatic soldier at the theater. His parents died, and he escaped from the siege. A totally unbelievable scene. How can you cross amongst the drunk Soviet soldiers? They find a bicycle. The last scene is the two of them symbolizing hope, innocence, the lack of knowledge of what really was happening. She said, Frau Jung said that she never knew what was happening, what the Führer really was. This is the rebuilding of the new Germany. But if you want to, I have the permission to show you 2 minutes, and this will be the end of my presentation. In Putin's Russia right now, there is a quite extended kitsch model that comes back on the same models. This is from before the pandemic, before Ukraine war. It's a commemoration of an independent filmmaker about We are running very, very late. We'll leave time for 2 questions, no more. Please make questions, not comments. Thank you. It's been super interesting. I would like to ask you how this memory, Soviet memory of war, how does it live with the pacifist propaganda that is developed after World War II with an image of peace, the white pigeon using children and women in the concept of solidarity with countries that fight for their independence. How is this tension managed? Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. My question will be brief. How has the narrative evolved in Germany? I'm speaking about a nearly German pride, in order to overcome and accept the blame for the Holocaust, their guilt for Holocaust as a new German nationalism. I'll start with the last one, if I correctly understood you. Well, the guilt or this German exceptionalism with a critical memory in the past has become of a patriotic pride. Well, there's some of it that's been highly criticized by some German authors. Leda Ashman has a sentence that summarizes it all. She says, Germans, before we were masters on how to do atrocities, and now we seem to show the rest how to overcome our traumatic past. Let's leave each society to find its own or their own way, because our recipe doesn't have enough knowledge for all countries. There's still a lot of it. There's a different way in which the national pride, the national German pride, which has important problems to rebuild a society in the post-war. It's a very federal Germany discourse, because Eastern Germany said, well, we are not a state that has to accept the problems of the Third Reich, of Nazism, and there's been a collective exculpation. This also allowed the individual exculpation, and this is behind the growth of an alternative for Germany in the eastern states. It would be a long debate, but we have to say that inside the conservative nationalism in CDU in the 1980s, etc., we could observe a certain type of the discourse of country memory. It's enough to beat ourselves up. One of the ways was what I would call the obsession for performance. The idea that we are the most efficient. We have built the German economic miracle thanks to a generation, the word kids. But also we've had people in jail for many years, and they had a certain mentality of sacrificing themselves for the collective groups and for the economic growth. In the 1960s, we had already been overcoming it all, and we started going on vacation. The Germans that were repatriating from Eastern Europe are there. Arthur Richter also mentioned that there was an important element of the success of the own will. So it was striking to see that the executive meetings in Germany included the watch in the right hand. Why? Because they had learned that as officers in the Eastern Front, so that the watch wouldn't shine in the dark. There was a detail as many others. Right now, what happens? That 40 years of systematic policies also generated a certain degree of routine of that discourse. There's a full generation of grandchildren. And these people, relatives of those who lived in the war, well, all this falls behind them from far away. They take them to see concentration camps when they are 16. They have places that act as memorials or reminders. There was a very well-known film called Fuck You Goethe. This means Fuck You Goethe, actually. Young teenagers in the institute who protest for everything and say, well, no, it's history. Class, oh damn it, now we'll hear more about concentration camps. What a pain. So we could think, or some people say that this is also behind the alternative for Germany, that maintains in some places to some, Nazism didn't exist, but we better don't talk about this. In any case, this is the same as in Spain. Well, Frankism didn't exist. Some people say, well, the pride about these people who was in the Wehrmacht, he didn't kill anyone. He didn't really know what had happened. That's why the big impact of historiographic findings. But my daughter, we lived in Munich with 16 years of age, went to Dachau. She came back being very impressed. I think that Dachau is the closest of such places to Munich. As a historian and as a father, I said, what was it like with your classmates? I said, I heard some people saying, those that had a non-German origin, saying, oh man, this Nazis and Jews, that's an exaggeration. And then some told jokes about the Jews, about concentration camps, etc. And she said, all this after the visit in Dachau has disappeared. They were so impressed. All this was, well, the theta value. What's behind, well, there's a certain exceptionalism, true. And there's a possibility. Some people say, why couldn't you find a written agreement between Popular Party and the Socialist Party in Spain? Well, these comments come from Germany. Germany is not Spain, and Spain is not Germany. It was a contradiction to celebrating the RDA, and in Moscow celebrated the parades. The clear exaltation of peace and this justificative discourse of World War II, the effort of the Soviet War, had been the liberation of Europe against fascism, and that was the destructive philosophy, and that was meant an effort towards peace. Only then, only the Soviet Union would be entitled to speak about peace. But many of the monuments to the fallen in the Red Army were used as a commemoration for peace. But people from Afghanistan, or from the war of Afghanistan, used it to their offerings. And they also built alternative memorials or complementary to those of the Red Army. That's a clear contradiction, but the official discourse explained it as such. One of the most popular magazines of literature of the Soviet times, it was called New Peace. And with this is when we had the de-Stalinization, and at that time we could see that the author of Life and Destination, Vasily Grosma, published some of his chapters of his book.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. It's true, and the international movement for peace has to do a lot with the Cold War too, that was fostered from the Soviet Union. Thank you for sharing your vast knowledge. We would spend hours listening to you. And now let's move to the closing remarks. And we will continue talking about these topics in the Basque Country and in other occasions. Thank you.